It's a real honor to be here, and really I need to thank Professor Nikki Clayton for this very kind invitation and undeserved introduction, and thanks to the organizers that made the whole organization possible. So I will share with you some little evidence from experiments that I've been running, and colleagues in the developmental psychology department have been running, mostly in collaboration with the Chick Lab, to show you that it is worth investigating newborn minds, and that we can acquire some knowledge. So I decided to put this very challenging title, How Can Wisdom Be Naive? But I hope that at the end of the talk, you will get some idea why I decided that sometimes even before salient, relevant experiences in life, biology predisposes minds and organisms to deal with the world in a very sensible manner. So we've been investigating newborn chicks mostly, but also newborn babies. And there are many good points for investigating the newborn mind, limited experience. There's plenty of knowledge and learning that takes place even before hatching and before being born, but we can control the experiences of the relevant stimuli that then we can use in experimental situations. So that's why we call them naive. They are naive with reference to the stimuli we are supposed to use. We use in real control experiments. And our idea is to highlight predispositions. Sometimes we find predispositions about processes that we thought were only displayed by cognitively more advanced species like humans or primates, like number cognition, and to highlight some constraints that guide learning and clarify developmental trajectory, mostly for the human, and also evolutionary paths. Well, when we have this joint venture and investigate the same issue in chicks and babies, it's particularly salient because these two species are at the extreme. The chick is, let's say, precocial, so they hatch, they can walk around, they can see things, they can feed autonomously. And the baby human is the most nutritious species. They separated, as you probably know, at least 300 million years ago. They have a completely different brain. They found different solutions to similar constraints. So it is interesting to compare these two species. Plus, sometimes we get some insight from the chicks that we can translate into the human babies successfully at times. Let's just remind that most of you were not here, but in the 1970s and even 1980s, the community thought that the newborn mind did not exist. So they thought the human babies didn't have a mind at birth. It was not worth investigating cognitive abilities in newborn babies, not to mention in newborn chicks. And even William James said that the world of the baby, the newborn baby, is a blooming, buzzing confusion. And that was a common belief for most of the 20th century, to the point that medical doctors didn't even use sufficient anesthesia when doing surgical procedures on newborn babies, thinking that they're not sentient. Of course, this is not what we think now. And we have a huge amount of evidence that forces us to now accept, and it forces the medical doctors in particular, that it is important to pay attention to pain, sufferance, and babies are fully sentient. And not just that, they are very competent, they are socially competent, and they also have many other building blocks of complex cognition. So you can see, like, this an interesting picture of neonatal imitation. It's not the Maltzoff and Moore original work published in Science in 1977. It's 10 about years after 1983, but that baby is 20-hour-old baby and still provides evidence of neonatal limitation. And there's an issue of life in which for the general public, the idea was that scientists hadn't gathered in 1993 enough knowledge to spread this to the general public. Yes, babies are socially competent, but how can we ask a newborn creature what they think, what they know? So I will cover very quickly this, because probably most of you know. We can assess visual preferences, and we're doing behavior. So of course, I'll be focusing on behavior. So we can assess visual preferences by direction. And you can see that even a close-up in the newborn, in neonates, you can see whether they're looking right or left. So if you place two stimuli in front of them, it is obvious. You can score whether they prefer looking at either on the right or left object. Of course, it's a lot easier with 3 months old, and when they get a bit older, you can also use like reaching and grasping, which is possible only from 4 months of age. What do we do with chickens? There's an image missing, yes, now we got all of them. So since chickens can walk as they hatch, we can ask them to choose between two sets of objects, two stimuli, and assess preferences. There's a tricky point, though, when assessing preferences. It is because when a preference is in place, you can, of course, demonstrate discrimination. But if there's no preference, you've got no idea whether that's because there is no discrimination or because there's no preference. So maybe I can ask you whether you prefer vanilla or chocolate. You obviously discriminate, but some of you will not have preferences. So with the newborns, we need to use some other technique, both with babies and with chickens, very similar, but opposite in the expectations, which is a two-stage process, habituating the babies, the newborn babies, to some stimulus, and then ask the baby to choose between the stimulus they had been habituated and a novel one, and we expect them to explore novelty. And with chickens, we can expose them to objects, and through this process, usually they acquire, they imprint on the objects, so they learn the perceptual features of these objects, and then ask them whether they prefer the familiar object and another object. And in this case, for chickens, what's expected is that they go to the familiar object. So babies explore novelty, chickens usually explore the familiar. They like to stay with the familiar object. That's, of course, sometimes things don't go that way, but as long as the animal or the baby makes a statistical decision, we can deduce discrimination. So in this picture here, we were rearing chicks with little faces. You can tell it's features that produce schematic faces. We know that baby chicks, like newborn babies, respond to schematic faces. It has been tested also by seminal work by Mark Johnson. And what we were doing here was an experiment to facilitate number discrimination. So we were not investigating faces, we were investigating numbers. So it is well known and described in literature that with even infants and chickens, they do not discriminate 3 from 4. They can tell the difference between 1 and 2, they discriminate 2 from 3, but they have big problems when it comes to 3 and 4. And people, the experts say it is because 3 and 4 are at the edge of small number and large number system. So we thought maybe it is because usually the test 3 versus 4 is made with identical objects. And think you are in the middle of three identical conspecifics. The real ones are never identical, but these are artificial objects, so they are identical, versus 4, they may not tell the difference. So we reared them with different faces and show that when we ask them to choose between 3 faces that are all different from one another, from 4 faces, they actually do discriminate, and they do prefer, they do decide between the 2. This does not happen if the features are not arranged to produce a face. Only if there is like 2 blobs that resemble the eye and 1 other blob that probably beak. This means that face recognition facilitates, so the social ability facilitates the processing. And sometimes colleagues investigate number cognition. They don't consider the ecology and the fact that discrimination is there to discriminate entities, not just to discriminate red balls or yellow balls. We have also investigated the ability of chickens to perceive or discriminate the impossible objects, like this impossible cube. Well, this is a b-dimensional figure that produces an impossible 3-dimensional object. So whether a newborn creature is capable of telling the difference between a possible and an impossible object assumes that the newborn mind is actually projecting 3-dimensionally in order to tell the difference. And the work was inspired by Sarah Schweiri's work. She did it on 4-month-old infants, and the infants, after having been exposed to a cube with the critical junctions masked, like occluded, the infants actually look longer at the impossible version. And that's the same as an adult. Adults usually find the impossible ones intriguing, so we look longer. We try to work out what's wrong in this image. I usually ask my students, and even if it's so straightforward, some students find it hard to detect where is the critical junction that makes the 3-dimensional impossible. So we did the same with chickens. We reared chicks with the occluded version and then asked them a test to choose between the 2 versions, the possible and the impossible. And as expected by zoologists, biologists maybe, ethologists, chicks look longer at the possible object. So probably they saw the possible object in the occluded version. But more interesting, once we assess discrimination, they discriminate. So since they make a difference and it's significant, it means that they discriminate. And that's interesting already. But even when we expose them in this final line, as completely naive chicks, we expose them to the choice between possible and impossible. In the absence of any previous experience, they still prefer the possible object. This means that the brain, the visual system, is predisposed to produce the 3-dimensional, probably project the 3-dimensional object from the 2-dimensional representation. And since chicks are prompted to choose the most salient and ecologically relevant object in the environment to imprint onto, it makes sense that they prefer the possible object. Well, this perception depends on the understanding of the overlapping junctions. And this is based on the ability to complete objects behind occluders, which is also why our visual system produces those that we call anomalous figures or anomalous surfaces. So you see a black square which is actually not there, and your eyes complete the edges of this black square which is perceived in a different color as the background. So this is an example of modal completion, and Kanitsa, who actually was the guy who made these figures famous, hypothesized that we are forced to produce the anomalous square because our visual system cannot do but completing the Pac-Man as circles behind the edges, behind the four corners. And this is the same that goes on in this other shape or in the Kanitsa triangle. So we, many years ago, investigated with Giorgio Valortegara A-model completion because it was a philosophical debate. Do animals complete objects behind obstacle, or they actually learn what's the actual shape? So is it learning, or is it like a visual process? And I will demonstrate that it is not learning. In fact, I have this very interesting image that I found in which you can see that you cannot avoid completing the central image as a square, even though you perfectly know it's probably a cross. And you cannot avoid seeing the images, these ones, as bizarre shapes, but you know that probably they are also crosses like those in the external ring. We demonstrated this in chickens. The literature was very controversial with pigeons, because with pigeons, the scientists had a very hard time demonstrating that pigeons do A-model completion. But for us, we thought maybe with imprinting, since through imprinting, the bird learns the holistic global properties of the hen or the mother. So we imprinted them onto occluded objects, and then we asked them a test what they discriminate and what they prefer. And after having been imprinted onto an occluded triangle, chicks preferred the whole triangle. This is not a final, of course, a good enough demonstration, because the whole triangle, it's not just the completed shape, it's also bigger. It has more red area, so there are many perceptual low-level features that can justify this choice. So we had to go through a number of controls, for example, rearing chickens, imprinting them with whole triangles, and then asking them to choose between an occluded triangle, which is visually completed, but actually has exactly the same surface as the broken one to the right, and they prefer the occluded one. We had many control conditions, and the one that convinced the referees in the end is the one at the right side. So we imprinted a sample of chickens, every experiment new sample, on the broken mum, and in that case they went for the broken mum and not for the whole triangle, even though this is bigger. So actually they were trying to reach the mum that was more similar to the original mum. At the time, the literature on human infants was supporting the fact that infants do complete objects behind obstacles only from 4 months of age, not below 4 months, because the newborns had been tested several times and they actually seemed to see 2 pieces when seeing an object behind the horizontal occluder, so that they dishabituated on the whole bar. So infants were habituated to a bar, a vertical bar, moving behind a horizontal occluder. If infants did complete the bar behind the occluder, they would dishabituate on the 2 pieces, showing that they had seen the whole bar. And this was true for 7 and 4 months old infants, but not for the young babies below 4 months, because they were dishabituating on the full bar, meaning that probably they had seen the 2 pieces. So conclusion was that infants very young could not complete obstacles, complete objects behind obstacles, And this phenomenon was developing with age, until in 2006, some colleagues from my department, I wasn't involved in this collaboration, they had the idea to consider the, biologists would say, Umwelt of the newborn baby, meaning they realized babies do not have smooth pulsed saccades, so they cannot follow smooth motion, and they presented babies not with a bar that moves behind an obstacle, but with a bar that tilts stroboscopically behind the obstacle. And in that case, with the stroboscopic motion, the newborn baby dishabituated on the two pieces, showing that past failures resulted from not from cognitive or problems in understanding objects, but from developing the ability to perceive motion. So it's a problem we always have with animals, to try and produce setups that actually are the right environment for the animals to show us their real abilities. We investigated biological motion. Biological motion, as you know, especially those of you who are psychologists, was described in 1973 by Gunnar Johansson, and that paper is actually one of the most quoted papers in psychology. And he claimed that since if we only need 200 milliseconds to tell that there's a human moving in those 400 milliseconds to tell that what's a kind of action. We can even tell the gender and the identity of the person doing the motion, if it's an actor that we know, for example, or a player that we know. Since the reaction time is so short, Johansson hypothesized that there is a predisposition. So if a predisposition is in place, why not testing our chickens? So we produced a biological motion of a hen and the scrambled version, and some foil presentations. I went too fast. Like solid motion, random motion, and even a walking cat. The cat was, what do you think the cat is doing? This is my cat, and I was luring with food, so you see the tail. It was obviously not hunting, but going for food. So we found that the motion of a hen is always preferred to any other non-biological motion, but is not preferred to the scrambled version. Scrambled meaning all dots are in phase but rearranged randomly. The scrambled version is not preferred to the hen, but it's always preferred to the non-biological motion. And even the cat was not preferred with respect to hen or scrambled hen, but preferred to the non-biological motions. So there is a predisposition for biological motion, and this predisposition is non-species specific. So it doesn't matter if it's a hen or a cat, as we know chickens can easily imprint on predators if if they happen to hatch in front of a dog, family dog, they can imprint easily, or on other creatures, so they don't have. So it's in line with what we know about imprinting. Well, after publishing this study, I knocked at the door of my colleagues in developmental psychology department, and I suggested them that since chickens see the biological motion, why not testing newborn babies? And I was kicked out several times because, of course, the idea was that babies do not have enough attentional span to process 13 light points, plus not having smooth pursuit saccades. It is impossible for them to make sense of all these dots. So my colleague said, you see, I go back just to show you again what you see. My babies go crazy if I project all these dots moving in front of them. And it took me several months to convince her. Say, but you know, my chicks do it, so why not trying with babies? And we did it in the end. And she said, your chicks are inexpensive, my newborn babies are very expensive, so very few babies were tested. And yes, that's why we demonstrated, that's how we demonstrated that newborn babies also perceive and are predisposed to pay attention to biological motion. And they don't have preferences between the hand and the scrambled hand. Yes, we used hands for babies in that test because some referees claimed that even though they are newborn, they still have experience of hands and humans before being tested. Our babies were about 70-hour-old. That's the time in which we can, not 20 minutes, like the neonatal imitation, we get them 1 or 2 days after. It's not my babies, belong to the colleagues in developmental psychology, of course. So I will sort of go to because I want to present you some ongoing research and leave you with some problem. So of course, when chicks imprint, the imprinting process is much more sophisticated than just simply memorizing perceptually an object. For example, they can imprint and they can abstract relational concepts. The work by Bartigno and Kochnik and Science 2016 is one demonstration. We demonstrated with Chiara Santolin that they can learn visual regularities and generalize the rule to new regularities. So what we have done with Mariella Consolo is to replicate some old findings about individual recognition. So we reared together 2 female chicks, A and B, and these pair, they can either interact freely in the cage or they could interact through a transparent partition. And then at test, A was asked to choose between B and a stranger chick. In this case, there was a one-way mirror so that the 2 attractors, let's say the 2 target chicks, could not see A, but A could see both of them, and A obviously, according also to what was reported in the literature, prefers the familiar chicken. So we had this idea of rearing them with a one-way mirror so that A could see B, but B was unresponding because B could never see A. This means that A has the same time span exposed to the same features of chicken B, but this time what changes is the interaction. And what happens is that at test, A has no preference between B and a new chick. And under some conditions, A actually prefers the new chick rather than the familiar chick, even though it has been exposed for 2 to 4 days to chicken B. This means that imprinting is much more sophisticated than we thought, and it incorporates also elements. It's not like a perceptual learning, I learn the features of this object. It's actually also incorporates elements of communication, interaction. B is not a good partner. I try to interact, B is an unresponsive partner. So if I have to choose, I don't choose B, I go to a new one that maybe, although at the moment both of them didn't see A, maybe the new one offers more possibility of an interaction. Right, this is a study we've done with number mapping onto space, and I think the video explains everything. Takes a while to charge. Yes, so chickens were trained to find food behind a screen with a given number. And for example, in experiment 1, the number was 5. They learned that they always had to go behind the screen and retrieve mealworm. Then all of a sudden, 2 identical numbers, smaller than 5, and in this case, the chickens go to the left, or larger than 5, and the chick goes to the right. As if they were mapping numbers onto space, we did also a second experiment in which number 8 was the smaller, because the training was with 20 dots, and in this case 8 versus 8, 8 was triggered circumnavigation to the left and 30 to the right. This is also the case in which we exported our study to the newborn babies and demonstrated the same snark effect also in the newborn babies, which were habituated on seeing sets of 12 dots and then dishabituated when seeing 36 versus 36 looked longer to the right, and with smaller objects, smaller numbers looked longer to the left. I'm almost reaching the end of what I have to say. This is a recent study. It's still under revision. We investigated the sound symbolism. It's actually an instance of cross-modal correspondence, because sound symbolism is what psychologists refer to the phenomenon for humans, because they linked it to language. We don't know about chickens, and if it's probably unlikely linked to language. So as you know, the majority of humans, many cultures and populations, regard these 2 shapes as Kiki is the spiky one and Booba is the round one. This is a very long described phenomenon many years ago, and we obtained data supporting the fact that when chicks hear the word Booba, they actually choose to walk towards the round shape. When they hear the word Kiki, they actually prefer walking towards a spiky shape. I show you the videos. So that's the training. The training is with an ambiguous shape, which has spiky and round edges. There's no sound at the moment. So the chickens are trained that there's food behind this shape. And at test, now they have the 2 shapes, one on the left and one on the right. The training, of course, the shape was either left or right, so it was randomly Kiki, 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 Kiki. Referees were very skeptical, so we had to run more experiments. We just finished collecting data, and we had to replicate this effect with 1-day-old chicks, because these chicks were a bit older. So the referees thought they still learn the Booba Kiki because they are actually roundish, so they are more Booba. In maybe their legs, their feet are more Kiki. And then we tried to devise a procedure that could be used to test chicks when they were 1 day old. And we actually ran experiments. We minimized exposure to the training phase and maximized it. So it was very few hours of experience, and it seemed to work. So I think we will answer to the referee. Let me just present you the final. Do I have a few minutes more? The final experiment, because I'd like to have some feedback from you on this, because it's still ongoing and we're stuck. I think that's the best conclusion for a talk. So I leave you with what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, so the interrupted task. We investigated number discrimination through perceptual grouping. Perceptual grouping is a process by which we group complex sets into subsets. And for example, symmetrical grouping is a way to split a number of dots into sets of identical size. So 9 would be 3 plus 3 plus 3. Obviously, here we come to the prime number, because prime numbers are the only numbers that can never be split into identical subsets. So we habituated chicks to see many even numerosities. I'll show you a video to show you what we did during habituation. So they didn't see just one even numerosity, they saw many even numerosities, one after the other, in different position, different color, different shape. And then they were placed in front of a choice between a composite number, which was an odd composite, or a prime number. So for example, we tested 9 versus 7, 9 versus 11, or 15 versus 13. This is what they saw during habituation. And they did this for 1 hour. For 1 hour, newborn chicks, these are day 1, were exposed to many stimuli made of even number of dots. And during test, 7 versus 9 or 11 versus 9, this way the prime number can be smaller or larger. The idea is that one of the two is more similar to what they had just seen during habituation, which is the composite number. So the odd composite like 9 can be subgrouped into 3, 3, 3. But the 7, for example, can never be subgrouped in symmetrical groups. And in fact, what we obtained is that chicks always explore the prime number. We also tested 13 versus 15, and they didn't manage. So 13 versus 15 is probably above their threshold. These discriminations are already too difficult to be performed numerically. When we assess numerical discrimination between 9 and 11, they fail. So we think they don't do it numerically. They do it perceptually somehow. And in fact, when we retested the 13 versus 15 by passively induced color grouping, so by grouping subgroups symmetrically and asymmetrically, they actually discriminated. So probably this could support the idea that they are doing this grouping, perceptual grouping. So these are the 3 conditions that we ran, and then we're stuck. And then I'm happy to listen to your suggestions. So we asked whether the preference for primes is due to the fact that habituation took place on even numbers. So it is a preference for novelty, because odd composites resemble even numbers. That doesn't seem to be the case, because we prompted them on prime numbers, they habituated them on prime numbers and tested them with a new prime number and a composite number. They still prefer prime numbers. So it seemed to be like a predisposition to prefer prime numbers, which is as a referee suggested in our first paper, which was a very good suggestion, maybe they just like the asymmetrical grouping. So we compared 9 versus 15 to composite number after having been habituated them on even numbers. And then we produced ad hoc symmetrical grouping or asymmetrical grouping by colors. And it doesn't work. So in this case, they don't prefer the asymmetrical grouping to the symmetrical grouping. There's no prime number there. They're both composite numbers. So maybe having a prime number there is the key fact. Finally, we, on the suggestion of a colleague of mine, a physicist, we habituated them with all possible numbers in nature, so primes, even, and odd composite, and then tested them again, 7 versus 9 or 9 versus 11, and they do prefer primes. So the question for you is, what's the mechanism? Are primes really special for baby chicks? Okay, we are only testing very specific case of prime numbers. We are not going into big prime numbers. But for mathematicians, what the chicks are doing is actually what they use as a definition of prime number. So symmetrical grouping, it's something that prime numbers cannot allow for. And is this relevant to the case of what has been described and now published in several instances in savants that actually deal with prime numbers quite efficiently? So I hope to have triggered your interest or ideas, and I'm ready to take your questions. And of course, I need to thank many collaborators that contributed to all this work. So thank you so much.